You're listening to The Big Lift, the podcast of Web Trends Optimize, the CRO solution that enables marketers and developers to maximize the ROI on their digital properties. Web Trends Optimize is a powerful, feature-rich and easy-to-use solution, all delivered within a fixed-price contract with no additional cost for increased functionality ever. During these podcasts, we meet some of the key influencers within the marketing and conversion world to understand their roles and examine their challenges. Today, I'm in conversation with Jonny Longden, co-founder of Journey Further. From his background, you would see that experimentation and conversion rate optimization has coursed through his veins for over 2/3 of his career. It's no wonder that he's fanatical about why using data and experimentation should be paramount for every organisation who wants to succeed. Jonny, along your career, you've had data and analytics as a common thread for nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
What is it that fascinates you about being within this sector? And would you ever think about changing?
I wouldn't change it, no. It's really been the sort of core of my passion, as you say, for most of my career. I think it's really about a temperament and a mindset, really. I'm sure like a lot of people have done these kind of Myers-Briggs type things, and over the years for various different companies, I've done those. And I think there's a certain mindset that just is in tune with data and sort of proof and evidence and things like that. And I think that's just the way my brain works.
As a matter of interest, can you remember what your Myers-Briggs characterization traits were?
I don't know the Myers-Briggs one, we used to do one at Sky that was in colours, which I think are more or less always the same colours. They're sort of like colour charts. And you have blue, which is sort of very logical and numeric and rational and all that sort of stuff. And then you have a red quadrant, which is sort of more entrepreneurial, sales, business focused. And I tend to hover somewhere in between those, but a bit more to the blue. So, and that fits really well because that's really like how I've generally described the skills that I have. It's a balance between understanding data and understanding the business side of things, which I think is actually reasonably rare. Like you tend to find people that are incredibly good analysts, but they don't necessarily have the communication skills and the business acumen to think about business strategy. And then you have the opposite, which is very entrepreneurial people or business people that have a vision and understand where they want to go, but they don't have the ability to or literacy to understand data. And along the years, the way I've really tended to describe what I do is about translation between those two things. So I can sit reasonably comfortably in both worlds, where I can understand a business requirement, translate that into something that somebody like a statistician can understand and deliver, but then translate that back into something that's actually meaningful. And years ago, I did work in more sort of data science really than in digital, where that was more appropriate. But yeah, that's how I would kind of describe the thrust of my career really, and what I've always been aiming at.
That must lead you to being particularly good in a digital world, especially today where the data seems to inform most of the decisions. Has that kind of moulded your career along the way because you've had such a passion around data?
No, it definitely has. And interestingly, the reason that I got into digital, which is about 13, 14 years ago now, was I was working for an agency that did a bit of both. We predominantly did direct marketing and CRM and database marketing and stuff like that. And I ran really the data science analytics part of that. But the agency also was doing website design and build and email marketing and things like that. And so I got exposed to the digital world through that. But what I saw was that the vast majority of people working in that world at the time, so doing things like digital analytics and conversion optimization, which was very nascent at the time, had no actual background in what you might call proper analytics. And interestingly, like things like Google Analytics and tools like that, they completely remove you from the need for what you might call actual analytics, which is the real sort of critical thinking aspect of it. And so I thought, if you put that background in, like raw data analytics with the digital stuff, it's got to be successful, which it was. And I've found that has been a big part of what I've focused on and what I've been successful at over the years is having the analytical rigor behind what is happening in digital, where otherwise things are sort of done for you. All the tools that people use in digital are presenting things in incredibly simple ways that anybody can understand, which is great. But then if you don't really understand the critical thinking that goes with analytics, then you can't really generate the same sort of insight and the same impact. So yeah, I think, that sort of analytical background has stayed with me throughout.
Because you moved into conversion rate optimization, CRO, pretty early on. I think it was somewhere around 2009, 2008, something like that.
About 2008, I think. I know Google Website Optimizer had only really been around for probably even 6 months when I ran the first ever test that I ran with it, which was on a Mazda website, actually.
And what was it like in those days?
It was very, very basic. I mean, obviously, there wasn't anything else to compare it with. So it wasn't, you had no real kind of judgment on what it was like versus what it could be. But, it did the job. It did the job effectively, what we wanted it to do. So at the time as well, I had coders that were really kind of looking after it. So I wasn't having to build the test myself. Which, interestingly, that's the way I thought it would always be, but it sort of moved away from that to being focused more on people without coding skill using it. But yeah, it wasn't. I don't think it was a million miles off a lot of the tools today. At the end of the day, they all fundamentally kind of do the same thing. With it's a bit more complex than that, but they are serving A and B really. Yeah, it wasn't too different.
You must have seen a fairly different approach to CRO than in those days, because at that time it was probably seen so much as a black art. In fact, I think probably today it's still seen as somewhat of a black art. But at that point it must have been like trying to push water up a hill, surely.
Oh yeah, 100%. Really, looking back on all that time, I would say the story of CRO really goes hand in hand with the story of web development generally and IT generally. So when Google Website Optimizer came out, what we've tended to find, we had clients who had websites, and the reason it was so interesting wasn't really anything to do with the testing. It was the fact that all of a sudden they could make changes to their website without having to go through what had previously been very draconian IT processes. So you had companies who had websites, and that website was managed and run by the same IT team that you would go and get your laptop fixed by. So literally like a group of guys in a basement of the building or whatever. And
some companies still haven't changed that.
Exactly, yeah. But people had no control over their website. They didn't even have a CMS mostly or anything like that. So they couldn't do anything to the website. So when these tools came out, overshadowing the fact that you could do testing was really the fact that somebody with no coding skill could make changes to the website. And that's really, I believe, where the term hacking came from, why a lot of people refer to hacking, because it literally was somebody outside of the IT environment with no access to the IT environment hacking the website as it appears externally to users. And that's what gave rise to that whole industry where people would go and hire a consultant who was on the outside, who would put this cool tool on your website and play around with button colors and things like that and tweak things. Meanwhile, anything major was still going through this waterfall process with the IT team. And although a lot of companies still have problems with their IT, most don't. Most have moved to having agile teams internally, or they've at least got agencies that in theory are more nimble. But the attitude and the perception of CRO has not caught up with that. And it's still very much seen as this sort of tactical, hacky thing where even companies, even massive companies that have big internal infrastructure around web development and innovation around web development, if they're doing CRO, a lot of the time, it's still this kind of separate thing where they've got a big roadmap of stuff going through this main IT team, which all comes from opinion and just seems like a good idea or annual strategy deck or something like that. And then they've got the CRO person over there who is playing around with sort of fairly simple front end elements and changing fairly basic things. And it doesn't make any sense, because really, at the end of the day, if it's done right, all it really is one, using research, analysis, and data to understand what it is that you should be doing to your website, or anything digital, and two, experimentation to validate that before you actually do it. Because even if you're interpreting data, that's still your opinion of the data, and you might be wrong. And that's all it really is. It's research and validation. And if you look at it like that, why would you do anything other than that? Because it's just putting a rational scientific method behind what you do. And at the end of the day, the one thing that you learn when you do a lot of testing is that it's very, very hard to guess what's going to work. The things that seem like no-brainers will every day surprise you by having a detrimental impact, and things that seem like they wouldn't ever work will have a really positive effect. And that is the reality of it. So you have to test everything. And really, my sort of mission, I kind of see it, my mission is trying to open people's eyes to that, because I think people just have this incorrect perception of what CRO is, and without really even potentially thinking about it. So one of the challenges is, I think you have sort of fairly senior people in businesses, and if you ask them, do you do CRO? They'd go, well, yeah, we've got a CRO person, so we do it. And or yeah, we've got an agent, our dev agency, we pay them for 10 hours a month of CRO, so yeah, we do it, we tick that box. And yet, are they really doing that? Are they really reaping the benefits of a proper, rational, scientific approach behind their decision making? No, they're using that old-fashioned method. So yeah, it's a rather long-winded answer, but that's how I see the history of it, and really why it's challenging even now.
I still believe there's a perception, even now, that every test has to be seen as positive. And yet we learn so much more from those tests that often aren't successful.
Yeah, that's a really difficult thing, and that's something that we grapple with now on a daily basis. Like, how do you demonstrate the value of what it is? Because yeah, people will just kind of look to the winning tests and the benefit of those winning tests. And really, it is exactly as you say, it's all about learning. And there is no such thing as a losing test if you properly, learn from each of those tests and learn from what happened afterwards, and pass that into further kind of innovation. And yet, it's really, really hard not to talk about winning tests in terms of value and things like that. I think it ultimately comes from the fact that, again, over the years, because of that background that I just talked about, it tends to be associated with other types of marketing. So again, going back years, anybody doing CRO would probably have been in a marketing department, as opposed to in like the IT or web development team or e-commerce team even. And so they're ultimately measured in terms of performance in the same way that PPC or SEO is. And so I think that's part of the challenge, is that people want to look at it and look at the benefit of it. It's a line item cost on a spreadsheet, and so is PPC, and so is SEO, and so are other things like that. And they want to see the ROI benefit of it in the same way, and they want to think of it in terms of performance in the same way. And yet it is so fundamentally different to those things. It's not a channel. It's not a tactical thing. Really, it's just a way of life in a way. It's just, it's a way of making decisions in a different way. And if you could articulate the real benefit of it, it would be in terms of risk management and de-risking your web development investment. Because if you're not doing anything like experimentation, and let's say you have a retainer with your web development agency, and you're just giving them stuff and putting stuff in the backlog, then there's a very good chance that the vast majority of that stuff will have no impact, and therefore you have wasted that investment. But if you put an experimentation process before that, where you are testing small things in order to prove the value of doing something slightly bigger, in order to improve the value of doing something slightly bigger, then by the time you get around to investing anything major in any sort of development, you should have proven the fact that that is worth doing and that's going to work and that's going to have commercial impact for you. So really, regardless of whether tests win or lose, if you see it like that, then what you're doing is you're increasing the return on investment of your production web development. And that's how we try and get across the value. But it is hard. It's hard to get people away from the idea of chasing winners, really.
You're obviously still very passionate about CRO, which is fantastic to hear. But actually, reading through your website, the Journey Further website, I did notice that you mentioned that digital media was a murky world.
Yeah.
Could you explain what you meant by that, and how does CRO fit inside of that?
Yeah, so where that comes from, I mean, the founding principle of Journey Further really is about transparency. Robin Skidmore, our CEO and founder, previously started and built and then sold an agency called Epiphany, and so was very proficient and knowledgeable about the whole world of search and SEO and PPC and marketing generally before this. And the founding principle of the agency was the realization that a lot of what happens, particularly in some of those kind of marketing channels, is a bit smoke and mirrors, really. And a lot of clients don't understand how things like charging works properly. They don't really understand what their agencies are actually doing and, what is involved in it. And in a way, a lot of agencies, either deliberately or at least subconsciously, keep their clients in the dark about that because it's of benefit to them. And yet the world is changing, and at the moment you've got a lot of clients in-housing a lot of this stuff, and CRO is one of those and has been for some time, where a lot of companies want to try and do it in-house. And so it's not really in anybody's favor to work in this sort of black box way, and that applies really, really well to CRO, because I think based on that background of the idea of hacking, where in the past, a lot of people would hire a CRO consultant or agency, and they effectively go away and say, don't worry about it. We'll put this tool on your site. We'll do some testing. And we'll come back and tell you what's worked. And the client would probably not really have very much to do with it, not really very much to understand about it. And the way that really translates into that whole proposition of Journey Further and CRO is to do with statistics. Because very few people really understand how to measure A/B tests properly. And if you don't understand it, you can really go so wrong that it's really not worth bothering. So I've experienced many times over the years talking to people about how they do CRO, either in companies that I've worked where they've done it already or people I've met. And you find things like they will run a test and then literally the next day stop it and go, yeah, this is one, because it's got a 98% significance, and yet it's only been running for a day. It's got 10 sessions in each variant or whatever, and that is just through a sheer lack of understanding of the statistics. And I think that for many years, and I don't think it's so much the case now, but I think for many years, a lot of third-party agencies and consultants really capitalized on that. And especially back in the day when I first started doing it, most CRO companies charged based on performance, where they would basically take a cut of the annualized benefit of each winning test. And now if you're doing that and your client doesn't understand statistics, you could very easily make any test look like a winner. And you can certainly stop tests early, because the effect of the test is almost always going to be far greater in the earlier stages. And if you're then annualizing that over a year, then you're going to earn more. So I think that that's really just created an environment where a lot of people, again, don't understand 100% what it is. It's seen as a bit of a dark art. And yet, going back to what I was saying before, really the opportunity is for them to simply put almost a scientific method in their decision making and to understand that properly. So I actually fundamentally believe that experimentation ultimately best sits in-house. And so we really exist as an agency to be an agency and to provide the outsourced stuff that people haven't got, and to do things for them, but also in the long run to help them install that way of thinking and that philosophy internally, and eventually to not need us. So because of that, we are totally and unreservedly sharing with everything that we do and educating people about what we do and how we do it, and providing systems and processes in a way that can eventually be migrated internally completely when they need to.
Is that where you start to introduce your philosophy, which is the economic performance framework?
That's a good part of it. Yeah, that's really part of what I would say are the building blocks of a proper experimentation function, and that is the strategic part of it. Because if you're going to improve your business, if you're going to use experimentation to improve your decision making, you have to have a really good articulation of where it is that the business is going and what it is you're trying to do. The worst case scenario is that you just go, right, let's improve our conversion rate, because by doing that, you will potentially ignore all sorts of important aspects of the business. Your conversion rate is a poor proxy or leading indicator of revenue, which is itself a poor proxy for profit. And, for example, a company might have particular product lines which have far greater margin than others. And if they just improve their conversion rate, they would ignore that. They would, indiscriminately increase the conversion of all products, whereas actually it might be more beneficial to focus on a particular product line. Or they might have a profit strategy that's based around something like bringing customers in on a particular kind of loss-leading single product and then nurturing them through relationship marketing into more profitable customers. So, if you don't understand all of that, when you approach what is effectively continuous improvement and improvement, you're not really improving the right things. You're not driving the business in the right strategic direction. So that e-commerce performance framework is about articulating what the business is trying to deliver and breaking that down into discrete objectives that are focused on the customer, because obviously you're trying to influence customer behavior. So how do you map out the different parts of the customer experience that you have to influence? But very concretely, what is it about each of those things that you're trying to change? How do you measure whether you're doing that? And therefore, ultimately, how do you pull those levers and actually change those things?
Within this framework, you talk about the 6 pillars, which are attract, connect, inform, convert, deliver, and nurture. How do you weight them, or does each one of those pillars have equal weighting?
No, they might have different weightings entirely, yeah. I mean, really what that should lead to, what that framework should lead to, is a set of metrics and a set of measures, because for each pillar, you're trying to understand how are we doing right now with this pillar? How well are we delivering against this pillar? And if we're not, how do we find out what we do about that? So really, in a way, your measures need to understand in relative terms how each one's doing. So, for example, however you do it, you might determine that the acquisition level, the attract level, where you're bringing people in, our traffic levels seem pretty good, which you might determine from your own historical data or some sort of benchmarking or whatever. But however you do it, you might determine, we don't need to place that much focus on that bit. And yet then we're actually not cross-selling or we're not converting as well as we could. So that's our focus. So the measurement and the analysis of those pillars should lead you to the strategic direction of where do we want to place our attention, where do we want to place our focus, which could be about benchmarking or whatever, but it could also just be about your actual own strategic direction. So again, going back to strategy, a company might have the objective to really sort of justify a higher price point through branding and stuff like that. And so you might just go strategically, well, we're going to deliver against our profit strategy if we really, really focus on brand and style and stuff like that, and justifying a higher price point. So, there's no generic standard answer to that question, but there absolutely should be weighting and focus on each of those unique to a specific company, which should come from their strategy and their data.
In relation to this e-commerce performance framework, how would somebody who has no experience in CRO or conversion rate optimization or even experimentation start to build a process like that? And ultimately, how would they get buy-in from senior management or their board?
Yeah, I mean that framework is not per se about experimentation. It can drive all sorts of things. Ultimately, it's about how do you drive action. My background has always been in experimentation, optimization, and things like that. So that's just the way that I approach strategy. I think strategy doesn't really make sense unless it concretely changes the actual behavior and action within the bottom line, front line or whatever parts of the business. So that's what that is. It's about articulating business strategy in a way that can then be measured and understood with data in such a way that then you know what to do about those things, what are the levers that you're actually pulling. And some of those things where it pertains to the website, you would want to experiment on. But there are other things that might just be about marketing or fulfillment when it's e-commerce. And so it has an enormous benefit to somebody working in experimentation because it's how they can articulate what improvement looks like on the website. But it is also just a framework for driving performance improvement across the business, and that's actually where it originally came from. So I have worked on things like that with in my sort of management consultancy days that were simply about performance improvement in business, and I've consulted with big companies recently in a similar way, which has nothing to do with experimentation. So I think if anybody wanting to champion that just needs to present it in the right way and to show that it's about driving action. And a lot of the time companies haven't really thought about that. What I tend to find is that most companies have at some point somewhere had this discussion and thought about what is our specific way of generating margin, but they just don't necessarily communicate it through the organization or execute on it in a way that means that every single person, somebody in the marketing team delivering campaigns, somebody in customer service overseeing the way customer service agents work, that kind of stuff, like those people aren't necessarily operating to that same strategy and that framework. They might be operating to something generic. So your marketing team might just be trying to drive return on ad spend with your PPC. Is that the right metric? Sometimes it's not, depending on your profit strategy. So that's really what it's about. It's about making sure that the people on the ground doing stuff are aligned to what it is you're trying to achieve as a business. And if you deliver that in the right way, mostly nobody's going to disagree with it.
As we speak, we're just coming towards the end of lockdown 2, and lockdown 1 saw many companies scrambling to sell more online, especially those retailers whose physical stores were closed. Do you think that during that period companies were less diligent on the data they used to drive their growth?
Absolutely, yeah, and to the detriment of their business, probably, really. I mean, it's a natural thing. COVID happens, it's going to create a reaction, and you need to react quickly. And there's a lot going on in the business as well. Like some businesses have had to sort of all of a sudden do digital transformation of call centers and all sorts of stuff. So they've got a lot going on. But unfortunately, the knee-jerk reaction is not always the best one. And what I've seen is this particular focus on traffic driving. So companies particularly who might suddenly be suffering decreased demand for their products or services because of COVID will respond by paying more for the traffic, by trying to put more money into the traffic to maintain the same levels. And I think that's a mistake, because what you're effectively doing is really accelerating the law of diminishing return, because the demand is shrinking and everybody is trying to buy more of it. And so in order to do that, you have to go to even more irrelevant audiences to try and generate traffic. And so the return on investment of that money is really diminished because of that. Now, whereas if you were to focus on the throughput of your website, if you're an e-commerce business or something, then it's a different story, because if you want to increase the traffic to your site, then you have to disproportionately increase the spend on that because of the law of diminishing returns to get that traffic. If you want to increase the conversion rate of your site, you do not need to increase the spend on hosting platform your web development retainer particularly. In fact, you can probably reduce that. All sorts of things. You might need to spend a bit more on the process of experimentation, but you can increase your conversion rate without increasing all of the associated costs that go with your website. And therefore, that is a much more profitable way to generate more revenue. So, but you wouldn't necessarily think that. So I think, I've seen that like there's a knee-jerk reaction, which is like, let's just get more traffic. Let's try and get more traffic in this diminishing market. But it's not really the right thing to do, I don't think.
Even after lockdown 2, I think the government is showing the potential of an economic decline over the coming months and even years. And many companies are cutting back on recruitment. Do you see that more or less digital marketing, in a particular CRO, will be done in-house?
I think at a very sort of high level macro, view of the market, I think just the increased focus on digital generally should fare well for most people doing CRO, whether in-house or externally. Like a lot of businesses have suddenly realized that digital is far more important than they thought it was before, because consumers have suddenly realized it's more important to them than it was before. So you've got huge swathes of consumers who would never have bought things online before, who have had to, and they've suddenly gone, oh, that was quite easy. I'll do that more. So you've just generally got this greater focus on digital. And where that's a purely digital business, they will mostly be doing it, pretty okay out of it, unless they're in travel and stuff like that. But that will come back with a massive surge at some point. But a lot of businesses, they're kind of more half and half, and they've suddenly gone, right, digital's where it's at, and that's where it's going to be at. So I think mostly, you'll see that budgets are tending to be shifted towards digital. However, conversely, I think what it's made people realize is that they can be more efficient than they thought they could be. And, even just things like people working from home, that's quite effective. There must be tons of companies out there going, do we really need an office now? And things like that. So undoubtedly, everything's going to change. But I think really the impact on CRO specifically will be positive, in the sense of, I think there'll be more interest in it and demand for it, which is purely because of the increased interest in digital. The challenge for agencies like ourselves is that going hand in hand with that will be more focus on wanting to do it in-house. So, as businesses go, right, actually digital is really core to us, it's a really important part of what we do, then they naturally want to hold that close and do things in-house. So, would be less likely to want to use an agency. But again, that's I think that's been happening anyway. That is the natural sort of way things are going, and that's a big part of why our proposition is that we kind of set up to help that. So, but that's the way I guess what will happen, but who knows.
As we draw this podcast to a close, I've got a final question for you, Jonny. What would you say to businesses that are looking to implement CRO for the very first time?
The overarching thing I would say is it's easy to do, but it's very, very easy to get it wrong. You can very easily go and get an A/B testing tool, tag it to your website, and start running some tests. But that is a million miles from having a proper experimentation function and doing it properly. And I think you don't underestimate how much sort of skill and expertise goes into doing it properly, particularly with things like statistics, but also having a really rigorous process around it in order to be able to move fast and to actually deliver the best value. All this stuff is not something that you can just install by hiring a really junior CRO person and expecting them to be able to do everything. So that's what I would say is, you to get the most out of it. The end game is that you're using data and experimentation to drive the vast majority of your decision making, and that does not equate to buying an A/B testing tool. and hiring a junior CRO person. So yeah, it's something that needs thought, it needs expertise, and it needs skill. And whether that's hiring an external agency or just making sure that you hire sufficient senior people and plan for a lot of internal resource, either way, you need to have a serious plan about it.
So, Jonny, thank you very much. It's great to hear someone so passionate about CRO and express their views and opinions. Today, as we sit here on Black Friday, it'll be interesting to find out whether Black Friday is going to follow the pundits, some of which are positive and some of which are negative, to see actually what the outcome has been during this remarkable year of 2020. So if I may, I'd like to be able to touch base with you again, Jonny, in about 3 months and see what the outcomes were and to see how 2020 ended up. But for now, thank you very much, Jonny. It's been great.
Thank you very much.